Hello, everyone. Can you hear us at the back? That's good. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up from there. So, welcome to the event. So, this is an event that's all about facilitation, and we're doing it because we're celebrating the launch of the new facilitation training.
Can you go really closer to the mic?
Is that better? Yeah. Okay, I'll start again. Welcome, everyone. So, this is an event all about facilitation. We have our wonderful speakers here today. We have Morgan, who's going to be talking a little bit about the history of facilitation and her history with facilitation, as well as kind of like identities and personalities that happen within facilitation. Kennedy, they are going to be talking about holding differences and the approaches that you can do to doing that. And Naiara will be doing like personal collective tools for transformative facilitation and organising. I will be kind of like the compere, your host today, and I am facilitation at Neon. We're doing this event today because we have just created and launched a new facilitation training. Whoop, whoop. Thank you. There are little leaflets about there if you want to take that back to any of your workplaces and potentially book onto the training. So that I think is all of the stuff about today. For safety things, fire exits are there, and the fire meeting point is in the park. Please don't set fire to the building. So we are going to start off with Morgan talking to us. I will let you know if you go over 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Am I close enough to the mic? A little closer. Normally I would just project, but as you may be able to tell from the gravelly nature of my voice today, I overused my vocal cords this weekend and I could barely speak, but I'm happy to be here to speak with you today. So I'm Morgan, she, her. And I think if I'm going to talk about anything, my usual way to begin is to talk about history because I'm a historian. And to me, everything in activist communities is related to lineage transmissions of activist tactics and skills, right? So when I think about facilitation skills, I think about the people who gave me my skills, and specifically, I was very, very lucky to learn everything I know about facilitation from lesbian feminist organizers who really raised me up in my late teens and early 20s in Canada. A lot of those organizers had learned facilitation through earlier activist movements that they had been part of or had known people who had been part of. For example, if we look at like, are people familiar with ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power? I'm seeing some nods. So for those who are not nodding, it was a group founded in 1987 to fight back united in anger against government inaction on the early years of the AIDS epidemic. All of those activists within that group, some of whom I'm lucky to know, received very direct training to learn how to actually bring communities together and fight back. They were trained specifically by reproductive justice organizers and civil rights organizers who had spent the 60s and 70s in their particular fights and ongoing, obviously, as well as some members who had been part of gay liberation groups like the Gay Liberation Front, who are also active here in the UK. Anyway, long story short, I learned everything I know about facilitation from lesbian feminists and also from eco-feminists like Starhawk. Did anyone ever, any pagany people have ever read a Starhawk book before? Check it out, although a little wacky. Very useful with the facilitation skills, because she's got a lot in how to facilitate groups in there. Anyway, I began facilitating specifically within the sex workers' rights movement in Canada and abroad for many years. starting off with a big activist moment that happened in Toronto that I refer to as the Battle of Homewood, where myself and a few other organizers defended street-based trans sex workers in the traditional stroll in Toronto in the gay village from very violent gentrifiers who were physically trying to beat and remove them. Anyway, I continued on through, particularly through working with trans groups, organizing with groups of trans youth and low-income and HIV-positive trans adults for many years. But enough about me. What I have learned through all of that is that facilitation is key to any form of organizing you're trying to do. Where organizing fails often is poor facilitation, like every time is very poor facilitation. Successful facilitation is what creates strong social movements and affects change within our communities. So how do we do that? I don't want to go on too long. I know we're doing very short ones today, but my particular focus has always been on understanding people and roles. Having grown up in the theater, I love a role. So, and also, you know, being queer, I love personality types like astrology. I will immediately group people into boxes upon meeting them. I do want to know what your top 3 are. And if you don't tell me, I will find out one way or another. I do keep all of my friends' charts off to the side. But this can also be applied, well, not astrology, although maybe, that's maybe like too deep for now, but personality types can be applied to facilitation. I actually learned this through those eco-feminist pagan books by Starhawk from the 1980s, like Dreaming the Dark, where you can basically in any group of people, but particularly any sort of organizing space, see certain personalities come to the fore. I call them the star, the wallflower, the mediator, and the agitator. And people sometimes move between these different roles. But basically the star is like the teacher's pet. They want the spotlight, they want to be praised. They usually talk the most. The wallflower says almost nothing unless you really corner them for a response, and they make up the majority of a group most of the time. The mediator doesn't have their own opinions, but is constantly trying to fix everybody else's arguments. And the agitator is the one who's going to sometimes helpfully and sometimes not throw a wrench into any conversation you're trying to have. Understanding these personality types and what they need from you as a facilitator is, at least in my experience, key to actually getting people to work together. If you know and can predict what people's needs are going to be based on how they're acting within a space, you can shift the energy so that people are working together and not against each other. The other thing is around roles. So there are particular roles within a group that you want to make sure people know need to be inhabited, like timekeeper, note taker, obviously facilitator, that's what we're here to talk about, and lots of other things down the line. But if you don't have anyone who is willing to take up or assign these roles, or even knows that they should be taking them, absolute chaos in most organizing spaces. You won't get anything done. You won't have any notes to show for it at the end, right? So you need these kind of things in place. Having an understanding both of the personality types and the different roles we can play within groups helps us to be more group-oriented and goal-oriented rather than individualist. And when we're trying to do any kind of organizing, right, for social change, we want to be able to at least partially park our more individualist, capitalist kind of personality pieces and work together, move together as a group. It is also really important, I think, in understanding how to manage these personality types, because it helps us ensure that everybody in the room feels heard and that their voices are taken in. Not everybody's personality is going to want to be heard in the same way. Some people are going to want to be heard only one-on-one because they don't like speaking in front of a whole bunch of people. Other people are going to want you to listen to them for way too long, which is often me. So you have to understand how to kind of mold the space to make sure everybody is getting a chance. And I think through the personality types, you can really do that. Anyway, that's it from me.
Amazing, thank you, Morgan. We will do questions and answers at the end of hearing everyone speak. So if you've got some in your mind, just hold it now. And that's also for the people who are joining us online. There'll be a way for them to ask those questions as well. So now passing on to our wonderful Kennedy.
Hi everybody. Is this okay? No, nothing. Nothing. I'm like right next to my phone. Okay, hi. Nothing. Still nothing.
Are the mics on?
Great. Wow. Love that for me. Okay, so just gonna quickly briefly talk you through kind of how I got started, because facilitation as a role is really peculiar, it's weird. It kind of sits in between roles, it's kind of invisibilized. So I'm gonna just talk quickly about how I got into it. So about like almost 10 years ago, when I first started organizing and campaigning, in fact, a few people, Ash at the front here, was there when I first started campaigning like 10 years ago, when I was like starry-eyed about politics and optimistic about my hairline. I quickly came to realize in that context that moving groups and people through conflict decision-making processes was really important as a skill. And so alongside my campaigning and organizing, I sought training in facilitation and training. Specifically experiential learning cycles, which if you're a teacher, you might be familiar. But what experiential learning encourages a facilitator to do is when I'm working with groups of people, I want to elicit the experience in the room and the wisdom and knowledge that's already in the room to inform the conversation we're having. And also, if I'm teaching content for learning, it also helps that learning content land more if it's based in someone's experience as well. I also did training in counseling skills to help my practice be better at holding conflict and a strong emotion as well. So as I'm speaking, that's kind of the experience that I'm holding and moving through. So what is facilitation as a thing? And I kind of, there's lots of different definitions everywhere, but I kind of try to think of one that's like succinct. And facilitation or facilitators lends to a supportive environment that enables groups to move through processes, whether that is a conversation, a strategy process, or implicit or explicit conflict. I see facilitators as experts on process and not content. And so what I mean by that is, that's a phrase, experts on content, not process. It's a phrase that I borrowed from my counseling training. And what I mean by that is if I'm holding a strategy process, I know how to get you from A to B, but the content of that strategy I know nothing about. Well, that's the assumption I should make as a facilitator. That's the position I hold. Definition. So given that definition, where I've seen it useful in campaigning or movement building, there's lots of ways it's useful, but 3 key ways are moments of political whirlwinds. So an example of that would be like the murder of George Floyd, when there's big mobilizations and a lot of the anti-racist movement mobilized, there have been a lot of coalition building. And in that moment, there's people in rooms facilitating conversations, and that's where facilitation becomes really important, because often you need to move quickly, precisely, and in a thorough way. And facilitators and facilitation can help that. Similarly, when there's like a government announcement and you need to respond very rapidly to something, but also you need to do it in a thorough and thought out way, a facilitator or a facilitated process can help that as well. And also another way has been through moving groups, no matter how big or small it is, through conflict. But I like to frame it as, and lots of other facilitators, I did not coin this, was through ruptures and repairs. So no matter how big or small the group is, you're always going to go through rupture and repair. And what a facilitator can do can support that process to be productive and healthy. And it's an iterative process. All groups go through from repair repeatedly and often become stronger because of it. It's inevitable. And so having a facilitator or facilitation in present, it can make it a productive one, not a kind of self-cannibalizing one. Yeah. Across all these contexts where I've seen it used usefully and it's been impactful, the thing that I've used is kind of an idea around holding difference and a competency to hold difference in different contexts. What I mean when I say difference is different identities, ethnicities, races, politics, values, emotions, feelings, bodies, and having a competency of how to hold that. And that's because people are messy and complicated and annoying and great and fun, but also like complicated. And people often to every conversation bring a whole world of context to the different conversations we're having. And as facilitators, it's important to hold that. I'm going to give you, I was deciding what to give this examples before this, but I think I'm just going to go for it, which is an example of this would be if you're a Black person that grew up in England, in a white majority country, you'd be used to the idea that if you're in a group of white people, that you're kind of just waiting for kind of the inappropriate or racist joke to happen on purpose or not on purpose, by accident or not. So it's reasonable to assume that if you approach a conversation and you're the only Black person in a room or a conversation, you might immediately in your body feel uneasy. Similarly, if you're a white person, you've grown up in a context that is really racist and with a racist media that teaches you that Black people are like more violent or quicker to anger, it's reasonable to assume that a passionate Black person might move a white person in, like explicitly or implicitly, to feeling uneasy. As a facilitator, it's important that you have a competency to hold that difference in experience in a room. Now, there are extreme examples and examples that I've held before, but it's important that you're able to hold that difference. I'm going to give, so tools and approaches that have helped me approach that. So it's never cookie cutter, it's always case by case, but 3 things that have helped me approach that as a facilitator have been, the first one is, right? The first one is, okay, cool. Understanding power. So I was trained by Training for Change. I was training for change, put your hand up, training for change, a hand. Okay, cool, great. They kind of have this framework for understanding power, which is I found really useful in a room and a discussion. So the first one that I talk about is social power. So talk about social rank and mainstream and margins or lateral power. So social power is the power that someone has before stepping into the room. Now, I'm about to be reductive and flattening of identity, so bear with me, I know what I'm doing. But if you are, say, an upper class middle class white man, when you step into a room, in theory, informed by structural power, you have more social power before stepping into the room than, say, a working class Black man, say, for example. That is social power, and how does that play up in group discussions? Another way of looking at it is rank. So when you're in an organization, a hierarchical organization, in a group discussion, is understanding it through, if you have a director, middle management, and assistant in a group discussion, that's going to, that's a power structure in itself as well. And the last one is mainstream and margins or lateral power. So who's speaking the most, who is the most social, who can guide the whole group discussion the most, who has more power in that way, and who's on the margins, so who's not speaking as much. All of these things interact with each other and they can be very complex. So for example, you can be a Black woman that's a director of an organization, and so you have a lot of rank power in a space, but someone could have more lateral power in a space. So someone could be really an assistant could be really popular in terms of lateral power in a space because they can move the whole group. So it becomes very complicated. So that's the first one. So that's the tool in terms of understanding difference. That's really useful. The second thing is inviting difference. So when I'm having a discussion, as a facilitator, I don't want to be scared of difference. In fact, I kind of want to encourage it. So if someone's feeling really angry about something, I'm curious about the person that's happy about it. If someone's really sad about something, I'm curious about the person that's not feeling anything. And it's the same with political opinion or nuanced political debate. If I feel the group moving in one direction very strongly, I invite the kind of dissenting voice and hold that difference. And having that approach makes me well placed to kind of understand what's going on in the group and make an intervention. And lastly, curiosity. So, and this is something I borrowed from my counseling training as well. It's the idea, and it's similar to what I was speaking to before, where people bring a context to any given room, is that if I've experienced a certain behavior over and over again, and there's a pattern that I've identified, if that beginning of that pattern emerges in a conversation, then I'm going to assume that consequently the same thing's going to happen. So for example, when I worked at McDonald's when I was 16, if someone comes and orders a burger over and over again, they always want fries, eventually I'm going to assume that they want fries when they just order a burger, and I'll just assume they want fries. To take it to the other extent, in terms of an extreme example, if someone starts talking about kind of, if any positionality matters and it's informed by own experience, because a lot of facilitation work, actually, you don't realize, it's a lot of self-work. If I'm facilitating group discussion, and I realize I'm saying so many words, and a white person with a posh accent starts talking about migration in quite an angry way, I might start being like, oh God, I've been here before. I'm like assuming that they're going to start saying some racist stuff, which automatically stops me from being curious. And so what that does, it stops anything new to emerge, breaking that pattern. And so that's kind of like what a facilitator holds in some ways, is like allowing space for something new to emerge and to be curious. And so those are the three things that kind of help me hold lots of different contexts, understanding how power operates in a room. What was the second thing I said? Inviting difference and the curiosity piece as well. So yeah, I just got really nerdy about facilitation, which honestly never happens. This kind of conversation is really rare and weird. So it was really had lots to pick from in terms of what to include in this talk. But in terms of like kind of land it, the thing that I've found facilitation to be most important in this work has been supporting groups to hold different conflict and strong emotion, has been like transformational in kind of how I've witnessed it build power in interpersonal relationships, and ultimately like affect change. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And last but no means least.
I'm gonna stand up, but I've got a song. Okay, please, struggling on this chair. From Naya, they them. More? Oh, I just need to get it. Okay, so the first thing I want to acknowledge, like, you know, my peers have, is like, yeah, I also learned facilitation and social movements, and I think, yeah, this skill sharing and this, I really believe that all of us can be facilitators, and that it would be really helpful if we all develop those skills. And I also kind of want to name people who've influenced me. So get ready for the name drop. Adrienne Marie Brown, Stacey Haynes from Generative Somatics, NCAM and Defo from Healing Justice. And I just want to say that like a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really shaped by their work. And I'm also a student of, a practitioner in focusing. It's a somatic approach that kind of, it's about really coming into relationship with our inner bodily felt knowing and kind of acting from a place of body wisdom rather than just being up in our head. So again, that's also shaping some of my thinking. So one of the things that was a bit of a change, like big kind of tectonic shift in my life, was discovering generative somatics. And so one of the things that they say is that they believe that individual, collective, and systemic transformation are interdependent. And while they can be furthered by themselves, they are uniquely powerful when held together. So that's the kind of question as an organizer I'm kind of like sitting with. How do we create spaces where personal, collective, and systemic transformation can happen? And you know, Adrienne Marie Brown says that facilitation is about making things easier for people. And, you know, as an organizer, you're making it easier for people to build relationships, to develop strategy, to develop shared vision. So really, my premise is kind of organizers are facilitators. And, you know, this kind of multi-layered thing happens all the time. So, for example, when I was organizing with the London Renters Union, when a renter comes into the room and they have their housing issues, I might feel quite alone and being like, oh, I'm a bit unlucky that this shitty thing happened to me. But actually, when we like hold space for people to share their stories, suddenly they're able to situate their kind of lived experience, not as like something that's happening within them, but that is a collective systemic issue. And so, you know, holding this kind of like story sharing space like allows on a personal level like a kind of development of political consciousness and really growing our understanding of like how our individual experiences actually shaped by systems. On a collective level, it allows the development of trust and connection and you know, again, we're able to like build a shared interest and understand that like my fight and your fight are the same fight, so let's do something about it together. And I also think that that understanding that then can shape and form the basis of strategy and really inform the change that we want to see in the world. So that's the kind of question that I'm with, like, how does facilitation allow transformation at these three levels? And I'm going to go a little bit more into each of them. So, individually first. So one of the things that I think I'm learning from like the Black feminist tradition is that organizing is both about being free here and now and also build towards a liberated future for the next generations. And so that's my question, like, how do we build our freedom now? And I think facilitation can help with that. So I'm going to just like hone in on one thing, which is that I think that white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, which is a phrase coined by Bell Hooks, kind of separates us, continues to oppress us by separating us from our bodies and from a deeper way of knowing. Not a deeper way of not knowing, but other forms of knowing that aren't just like in your head. And so this idea that our mind and body are separate, I think is like deeply pervasive, it's like really damaging. And for me, challenging that is like a key part of liberation work. And so that starts as well with us. So the kind of framework that, you know, people are talking a lot about around doing this work is somatics. So the idea of the soma is our living body in its wholeness. So it's really an approach that looks at our whole body. And it has its lineage in many ancestral practices that understand that mind, body, and spirit are an integrated whole. And that we are interdependent with each other, with the earth, and with all living beings. So what does that look like in the spaces that I facilitate? So some of the things that looks like is starting with a kind of consent-led grounding or centering practice, so that as soon as we step into a space, we are given permission to be here in our bodies. You know, it's hard to talk about embodiment without talking about trauma. And I do think that like we come with a lot of baggage, and like we should be bold about having those conversations about how trauma shapes our behavior and our responses, so that we learn practices that can support us to have more choice with our resilience. And also, I think this shared knowledge allows us to have more compassion for one another. And finally, one thing that I'm kind of curious about is what would it look like if we had the courage to invite a collective pause and kind of ask the question, how does this feel in our body right now? What does our body know about this situation or this decision that we have to make, or the group dynamics even. So that's so really for me there's like a piece around how personal transformation is about that reconnection with ourselves, with our bodies, with the land, but also with each other, and also really building more compassion and care for one another. And that kind of segues me into the more collective level, which is like, we want to build groups that don't reproduce the same dynamics, oppressive dynamics that we're fighting in society. That's not easy. And the thing is, like, as you said, like, it's inevitable that those dynamics are going to come up. So it's like, how do we navigate that skillfully as facilitators, but also what's the groundwork that we do that supports the group to deal with those issues? So for me, the one and most important groundwork is building deep relationships. It's really creating spaces where we're connecting with each other and learning about each other's stories. Because also if we're asking people to take risk with one another, we have to know that we'll have each other's backs. Then there's, you know, facilitating spaces where we intentionally develop our group culture. So, you know, what are the values that matter to us? What principles do we want our work to be guided by? And what collective practices do we engage it with that allow us to work in a way that is aligned with those values and principles? And I won't go into generative conflict because I think you kind of mentioned it, but like, yeah, holding conflict generatively, as Kennedy just talked about, I think is super important as well. And so the last part is like the systemic piece. And so what I would say is that like this personal and collective transformation for me is like this, the ground, it's like, it's almost like if you do that well, you're kind of building really amazing foundations to be able to build power together, to be able to be take collective action together and be really strategic and have some of the difficult conversations that we need to have in the face of like how freaking awful the world is really. And you know, like I think that that, you know, like it's our role to hold spaces where strategy can be developed collectively, and where we kind of hold that the people who are on the forefront of issues understand the issues most deeply, but also can envision the solutions. So I think I'll leave it there. I've probably spoken quite a lot, but yeah, I just want to say,
If you want to finish, you can.
no, it's fine. I'll just say, yeah, that for me really it's about those three pieces and how they come together, and that's what I'm kind of holding when I'm, you know, organizing a group. Like, how do I balance all of this? Yeah.
All fantastic, and for me, like, I'm really picking up kind of like a common theme around interconnectedness and about how, as facilitators, there's a lot of learning and growing from different groups. I wonder if there's anything that you want to share about how the role of facilitator can help enable that kind of cross-cultural and cross-group harmony and co-learning. That was almost a statement rather than a question. I'm very sorry. I can start up a little bit of it, like you work with gendered intelligence, and that was kind of where my starting off was, and that was very useful. And I think there's also something said about us being a panel of non-cis people, and the kind of learning that comes across there, and how it is often maybe those minority identities that kind of give space, but society isn't working. So you then have to start creating around, and that's where then you get these really good facilitators, because you've had to start it off from such a young age of kind of trying to recreate the world that you need to be able to survive. I wonder if, like, I know you've all worked with other organisations and groups, like, is there anything that you particularly bring from those groups into your facilitation now?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say that, like, every single group that I've been a part of has like been a learning journey. And I think, I mean, the thing that I would say is a skill of that a facilitator can, that must have, and that also allows everyone to emerge as facilitators, is really building a culture of like learning. I love this principle in immersion facilitation: never failure, always a lesson. You know, like I think witnessing each other, you know, getting it wrong and learning really like allows us to like work with each other, you know, grow our skills as organizers and facilitators. And I think there's like a lot of stuff that people do in groups to like help with that. Like, you know, I've been in groups where we've buddied up and people with less experience work with people with more experience. I've worked in groups where every month the facilitator rotates. Like there's a lot of stuff that you do in grassroots groups that really allow, I think, for the emergence of facilitators. I don't know whether that answers the question.
I can say something. This is also what happens when you get a panel of facilitators that don't talk. Like, so I'm like, why are you asking me a question? So I get like, what I would say to that is, in terms of cross-pollination when we're moving building, like getting like sharing knowledge across difference, essentially, whether that is in your approach, whether you're like a lobbying group or direct action group or whatever, and difference in terms of, I don't know, identity or whatever. What I would say, what is laid on top of that difference is the topics that we're talking about are often very emotionally charged. What I find is there's kind of often a pushback or a refusal to accept that there is an emotional conversation that is being had that's underneath the intellectual one. And a skill that you learn as like a facilitator, what you might learn if you take this facilitation training, is kind of to spot incongruence. Which what I mean by that is if someone is saying something but their body's saying something else. So if someone's laughing but they're clearly uncomfortable. And so and that's really useful as a tool to kind of start tracking, which is a facilitation term, to start tracking kind of the emotional state of a group, to kind of respond to it. And that kind of charge often comes at when you bring different groups that have different cultures together suddenly. That can apply to lots of different contexts. And I would say, yes, that often facilitators are often like informed by their lived experience. For example, I'm a middle child. I'm sure that had an influence on why I'm a facilitator. Just to respond to that piece.
Shall we open up the questions to the floor? So people in the room, if you just want to raise your hand and we can come to you. For people who are joining us virtually, there is a little Q&A little button at the bottom of your screens. If you just select it there, and then we will get one of our lovely tech people, Lola, to ask a question to you for you. So does anyone have any questions?
So I support a team of trans and non-binary people to facilitate training, largely for cisgender people. And so I'm really interested in what you were saying there, Kennedy, about naming that power difference in the room and how to remain curious, because we get the same rhetoric all day, every day. And I'm just kind of really interested in what somebody can do in the room to protect themselves where there's automatically that imbalance. And I suppose a little bit more on that, sort of how to remain curious and to move forward.
Yeah, that's a good question. Are we going to take more questions or?
Have we got any more questions in the room? If not, then no, let's just go with that one. Yeah. This one. Oh, there's one at the back. Do you want to ask a question, then we'll answer both?
I was just wondering,
Could you speak up a bit? I'll just also repeat that question so that everyone can hear, just in case anyone couldn't. So that you are facilitating a group, and that a lot of those people within that have other thoughts that they're bringing into the group, sharing, and it's how you facilitate within that. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, especially when if it's a common flow from sexual assault, which is quite related to it's impossible to never talk about because it's very related to wider industry. So it's not like you just completely shut it down or don't anyway.
Okay, so it's when the trauma is related to the thing that you are discussing and trying to explore as a group and how to safely hold that and navigate that as a facilitator. And Kennedy, what you had online question.
Oh, this it was could you speak a little slower? No. If I am speaking quickly, please just do like tell me to slow, just do this and I'll me that. Do you want me?
So yeah, I open both of those questions up to the panel. I think one was kind of directed more at you, Kennedy. So if you wanted to start, choose one, go for it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of things. I mean, like a lot of things to consider before getting in that room, obviously, and you'll know that, like around like therapy and like having good support systems outside of the room. I think also there's something about choice in terms of on that day, kind of hold that conversation, but also, yeah. But I think for me, in terms of my training, what I did was kind of sit opposite a lot of people to and practice that muscle of being curious. And then when they say something problematic, kind of have mechanisms for me to give it back to them and not internalize it. And in like counseling practice, got the thing called bracketing, which I'm sure people are aware of, where like what comes up for you in terms of in a conversation, you kind of build a competency to hold that and bracket it to one side, not ignore it, to be addressed later. I think in my training that they talk about is kind of, which I don't know, in terms of not having, I don't know, a strong container here where we know the politics of everyone in the room, this might sound really wet, but in terms of me, when I'm approaching that, I kind of pretend I'm a bit of like, I'm just a bit naive and I'm just trying to be authentically curious about that person and what's going on for them. And if I focus on them, I find myself not being hooked as much because I'm trying to be authentically curious towards them. If you're doing that over and over again and the same results are happening, that becomes harder. But I think it's a combination of that, of the care that happens before and after, and then just building that kind of muscle for curiosity and that thing of being just trying to be like engaged with that authentic part of yourself that is genuinely curious about that person's experience has helped me kind of build those things. But that doesn't sound easy, and yeah.
Along similar lines on that one, I have often found as a facilitator that, I mean, as a facilitator in general, I often have to park my own stuff. But specifically as a trans person working with largely groups of cis people, I've had to learn to look for what the meaning of what they're trying to say is rather than the language they're using, which is really difficult and sometimes takes quite a toll. But if I take the approach that I am more interested in what exactly they're trying to convey rather than have they got the words all right, it's more likely to be productive. I see a lot of especially newer trans organizers get really tripped up because someone has completely misused a word or used a very old word or something like that and spin out as a result. And I completely understand because internally, sometimes I feel that way as well. But the trick for me is to stop myself from spinning out and be like, wait, what is it they're actually trying to say here? Because usually, not always, especially in this country, my God, but like usually, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but the water in this pot is getting warm. But usually people aren't actually trying to communicate something absolutely horrific, even if it sounds that way. And so I have to do a little digging. And this actually takes me to the other question a little bit, which is that the other side of it is that when we're in organizing spaces, often the people who need liberation the most are the people who are carrying the most trauma and have often had the least access to any type of care and support around that, any type of skills to mitigate it when it comes up for them, right? I think a lot about the fact that everybody nowadays praises Sylvia Rivera. You've probably heard the name Sylvia Rivera. She's one of the people. She claims she was at the Stonewall riots, although as a historian, I disagree. Marsha P. Johnson says she wasn't there, and that was her best friend. So anyway, tune into my podcast, One from the Vaults, if you want to hear more on that. But Sylvia Rivera is a really complex character, and in my opinion, one of the most important people you can study as an activist because of what happened to her. She tried really, really, really hard to be involved in organizing. She was had been working as a street-based trans sex worker since she was 12 years old in New York City in the 60s. And she tried really, really hard after Stonewall to get involved with the early gay liberation groups, and was basically thrown out. I mean, not basically, literally thrown out of them, and became persona non grata and disappeared from activist spaces for decades until towards the end of her life she was brought back in. And part of why she was thrown out of those groups was a lot of racism directed at her, a lot of classism directed at her. And the other side was that she had tons of unprocessed trauma and was an incredibly difficult person to get along with. She was very explosive. Everyone, including all of her best friends, say the same thing, that she was a very, very, very difficult person. And I think that that is key for us, if you're going to be a facilitator, to learn how to be comfortable with people who are not easy to get along with, right? Who are carrying that trauma and having it pour out at times that they might not mean to have it come out at, right? If you struggle with that, you're really going to struggle organizing in activist spaces. And we all struggle with it. I find it very difficult. But thankfully, I have learned a lot of skills to be able to hold space and also contain when these things happen within a group. We have to be able to make space for people who are experiencing those trauma-based reactions and may have very difficult, very salty personalities on top of it because of all of the many experiences they've gone through, while also ensuring that the explosion of these things is not also harming members of our group, ourselves, and the overall group dynamic, right? It is a very difficult line to walk. Part of it, I think, it comes down to facilitators in particular, but anyone who's getting involved in groups who does have any kind of resources, mental, emotional, financial, whatever, to get ourselves thoroughly supported in our lives as best we can. The more stable we can be as a facilitator, the more stability we can provide people who do not have access to those things, right? People like Sylvia who don't have a stable home, who are doing a lot of underground economy work, etc. If you can get yourself within whatever your means are to be the most stable that you can be, you can kind of be the eye of the storm and hold that space for someone, right? Anyway, rant over.
Naiara, do you want to add anything to those two?
Maybe a very small thing around my understanding of your question is people bring their shared trauma, and that's like also what brought people together in the space, right? So, you know, I mean, I think it's important to kind of contain these conversations, but my sense is like if this stuff is like emerging and getting in the way, perhaps the helpful thing is to like set up an intentional space where you talk about some of this stuff. Like, you know, it can be deeply powerful to have a sharing circle where we all share our experience about what's been going on in our lives. And I think if it's held well by a facilitator, then, you know, so much deep connection can happen, but also I think being witnessed and heard and feeling understood can actually go a long way to supporting us to be in the spaces, in organizing spaces. So I think that's the only thing I would maybe suggest around that.
Do we have any online questions?
We do.
Do you want to need to bring a microphone over to you? You'll just talk about
I think I can talk loudly. So I'll do a couple. I'd love to hear how you navigate or work with your own power as a facilitator in a space and how that shapes what unfolds in the group. And another one, how would you describe the ways that you hold space for people so I understand what this means for you as a facilitator?
Two fantastic ones. Yeah, I think we'll hold it to anytime. Who wants to go first on those two fantastic questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. On the how do I think about my power as a facilitator? Like when I'm training facilitators, I think about like a thing like no capes. So like I'm not there to save the group or save anyone from anything. And so I kind of take any opportunities I can to give power back to them. So what that might look like is often if I'm facilitating a group, especially particularly younger people, they might call me like sir. They think I'm a teacher, which is wild. And they might ask me questions and I'll pose a question back to them and give that back to them. There's very subtle ways that individuals in groups try to give you more power, and it's important as a facilitator that you kind of catch it and give it back to them, but also kind of humble yourself, like to be like, actually I can't save this group. And so that's basically, in a very short answer, I'm constantly tracking how much power and I have in swaying the group, and I constantly am trying to like give it back to them. Trying to think of another example of that. Yeah, I can't think of anything now, but I might come back to it. Yeah.
You know, what I would say around this is, I think it's a pretty common experience when we first get involved in any kind of activism or organizing to begin to look at the various parts of like privilege and oppression, or power and lack of power within our background, within our identity, how we move through the world. And I think that is one really key component as a facilitator, is to have a thorough self-understanding. I think the other layer that I would add to it that has been really helpful for me is understanding that in addition to that, I also have a very particular type of personality where, in my case, I'm a person who, you remember those personality types I told you about earlier. I'm a star. I usually like to have lots of attention, and I have very strong opinions and tend to lead automatically within a group. And sometimes that's really helpful, but often when I'm facilitating, it's the worst thing I could possibly do. And understanding that and reminding myself of that is what allows me to actually park all of those behaviors that for various reasons I've picked up throughout my life and only use them when it's going to be useful to the group, when the group needs a push in one direction or a push here, but otherwise to be able to take a step back. And I think even if you come from the total opposite direction, if you're the person who never speaks up in a group, who finds it very uncomfortable, understanding that about yourself is key to be able to work with the group and make the best of the skills that you have without falling into whatever traps your own personality has, right? Just on a basic level. So I think understanding both of those layers, the power that we have, the places where we don't have power, and also how our particular personalities set us up with strengths and weaknesses within a group. I think that's really helpful.
I'm gonna maybe turn the question a bit on its head, which is that yes, the facilitator has like a huge amount of power. And so I think there's like, how do you use that power well? And for me, there's a bit of a question around like, what is it that you're modeling as a facilitator, and how well is what you're modeling also inviting other people to step into that. So being vulnerable also invites vulnerability. The way that you listen and the way that you find the essence of what is important to that person also might invite other people to like listen deeply to what people are saying in the space. I don't know, the way that you're accountable and that you take responsibility if someone gives you feedback. So I think there's something there about like making sure that we're kind of like working with like integrity and are kind of like embodying the values and ways that we're inviting people to participate in the space ourselves.
And then I guess kind of like just checking back in on that second question around like, what does holding space mean to you in a sentence or two?
Or like, what was the experience of facilitator?
Yeah, as a facilitator, what does holding space mean to you?
Yeah, I'll just quickly like add to that. So one thing I think is really important to name is that when I'm working with a group or individual, I'm definitely acknowledging how I'm being perceived as like my identity and what that means and the impact that the conversation's having on that experience. And like I'm holding curiosity for that interaction and how people might respond to it as well. And I think that kind of what I'm bringing to the conversation is really important in shaping someone's experience of it. In terms of the experience, like what I am experiencing as someone that's holding space for someone, it depends on the group and what the objectives are of it. But I suppose that's what I'm doing. So what I feel really anchoring and grounding is what are the goals of the conversation. That's very front of mind for me. So actually, if someone does have a really visceral response to something, do I need to be curious about their emotional response, or can I just keep it moving to get to like the aim of the conversation? I'll notice it and track it. But for me, what's helpful in terms of my experience is I'm holding that. And in terms of I think something that's also important in terms of that is being authentic. So sometimes if I'm having an emotional response to something, I might name that as a way of soothing or naming what's happening in the undercurrent of the group. So if someone says something that's quite emotionally powerful, I might say, oh, that actually landed on me quite heavy. Like, I wonder if anyone else is feeling that way too. And that can go a long way to do two things, which is soothe the group, make someone feel heard. But then also level power. So I'm a human as well. I'm not an empty vessel in this conversation as well. So it's going back to that power conversation. That's really important. In doing that, I would also then think about the polarity. So what I talked about earlier, being curious about if I'm being moved, who's not being moved at all by that. And I'm saying all this with the idea of that I'm not placing judgment of this. I'm just noticing it. And what does that mean for my next intervention?
I would say, and thinking about the trauma example as well, that one of the things about holding space is not just opening space, it's having boundaries as well, that as a group there have to be lines at some point, which is going to vary in different groups, right? And even in different meetings of the same group, like it might be one night you do have a lot of time to hold space to talk about a lot of shared trauma going on, and sometimes you don't. And I really liked what you said about sometimes as a facilitator choosing not to be curious about the emotional reaction you can see someone is having, right? So I think that is one of the key things, is to learn where those lines are in the moment, to get like a feeling of them in the moment of like, okay, I can take this far, but for the group, I also have to stop it here. And of course, if behaviors or things begin to become harmful within a space, we also have to think about boundaries in terms of, okay, how can we respond to any harm that has happened, right? And I think in every organizing space I've been in, there's always been some kind of harm. It's very difficult to get through without some, I think, some of harm. It's going to come up. And when it's more major, though, we have to think about like, okay, how do we effectively address this, while also not trying our best not to throw people away or to disenfranchise them from being part of the group, if at all possible, right? I've come very much from a prison abolitionist and a sex worker background, where we try very, very, very hard never to cut anyone off in a permanent way. It might be, okay, maybe we need to take a little break for 6 weeks, but like in a permanent way, that would be pretty against my general ethos as much as possible. Sometimes real bad things go down. It's hard to walk back from, but yeah. Anyway, I'm just rambling now, but the whole thing over here is around trying to get a sense of how much can be open and where the boundary is for it.
I'm not gonna add anything. I think we such that.
So that brings the question and answer section to a little bit of a close. Now, normally what happens is we let you all go and have drinks, but this is about facilitation. We wouldn't be very good facilitators if we just talked to you the whole time and didn't make you do something. So you may have noticed there's arts and crafts supplies on tables over there and behind you and to the side. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at people who are either around your table, if you've got a table, or you're online. You're now a group. If you as a group could have a think about what is the ideal facilitator for your movement, think about the kind of skills, attributes, things that they might need to do, and if using the arts and crafts that we have around, find a way to pictorially represent that. And so that we'll give you, let's say, 20 minutes. Sorry, that was a wheezy laugh to do down the microphone. And for the people online, obviously you can't do this in groups, but you are welcome to do it. There is a Padlet, which we are going to upload, link to the screen, where you can then, if you want to take a picture of what you've done and pop it up there so that other people can share and have a look and think, you would be most welcome to do that. And then we'll just kind of come back together as a group in 20 minutes, and then I will let you all go and have drinks and food as you want to do. Is that good with everyone? Fantastic. I'm going to pass this microphone over to you two.
Hi. We had a cumulative project, and we developed it by bit. As the wind blew, the sun shone, and so yeah, it started off with a rousing episode about the importance of timekeeping. So we think an ideal facilitator coming from a hearty and kind place would also help the group keep time, because particularly when you're working on an important social issue, some of the people there may need to leave at a certain time. They might have childcare, they might have to get that last train. So actually working to keep time is really, really important in keeping that moving, but getting the whole group involved in agreeing what that means and what that looks like is fantastic.
So to represent that, we have a clock, but it's heart shaped, so that you're keeping time, but you're also being considerate and knowing when to let conversations go on, when to adapt your agenda. And it also has a little crystal ball in the middle. I think it's difficult to see, but that's so you kind of have to tell. Well, we thought it's good to be able to predict things, so kind of tell the future. I think that came up when we were talking about participants who maybe talk a lot. Anyway, participants who maybe present certain difficulties during the session, and if you can identify them beforehand and maybe reach out to them, or you can do work in the lead up to a session to try and mitigate some of that. We also have popcorn and trees, which represent self-care. Snacks and nature are good, and I will pass over to Amber.
Okay. We also found out that coffins are surprisingly punctual. And then we just added in here, make space, take space, and create space. So not only should you be doing that for the people you're facilitating, but sometimes you need to also make sure you are doing that. And then just some dogs in blankets. That was about don't/do lose yourself. So the times when you give some of yourself, but also other times when you need to put some boundaries in and be like, hey, that was a bit personal. I need to set that one.
Yeah. I really want to add one thing, which is just we talked about time, and that's my phone making bird noises. And I think we talked a bit about how important it is to not kind of reprimand people when they're late, because you don't know what their story is, and also because lots of people are late for lots of different reasons, and how they might feel coming into that space, and then how that energy impacts on others. So just being a bit generous and acknowledging that it's good to keep on time, but also to be generous with people who haven't been with time.
Do we have? Oh, we've got one person online who wants to share. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and bring them onto the group, onto the screen here. This is our first time of doing one of these events as hybrid. So thank you for your patience as we are learning as we go. So we have Rona. Oh, we saw you for a second there, Rona. Hi. If you could you say something, we can hear you.
Hi, testing 1 2. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Right. Okay. Can I, before I share what I wrote on the Padlet, can I just ask the lady who just spoke about being generous in terms of time? I didn't quite hear the end of that sentence. I'm hard of hearing. What did she actually say about generosity and time?
Shall I respond? Is that time? I'm so sorry, I spoke fast. Terrible. I just said to be generous with people who are late, because you don't know the reason why they're late, and to make them feel welcome within the group and make sure they have a chance to be introduced, basically, and be present. That was it, basically.
Yeah, I completely agree. Right, I'm going to go over to the Padlet now, see if I can go over to the Padlet. Can I go over to the Padlet? Let me see. Padlet chat. No, I can't access the Padlet, so I can't see what I wrote. Is there a way that you can give me the link to the Padlet so I can see what I wrote?
We have it up on the screen at the moment, and we will just share it with you, but that might make you disappear, so you might just have to be. Let's just click share and see if that works, but we can see it. But we now can't.
Yeah. Okay. So what I said was I didn't draw that drawing is not mine. I didn't draw it, but my ideal qualities for a good facilitator is something has just come up on. Okay. Empathy, shared humanity, the ability to listen, not to speak at people, to engage, to actually learn from others, because even though you are facilitating the group, it doesn't mean that you know everything. To help people to become, to be a catalyst, to help people to, motivate them, empower them to reach their own potential, to inspire them to be facilitators, to understand and meet people where they are, and adjust your personality to an extent. And for me, being hard of hearing and mobility challenged, to make those reasonable adjustments, to speak slowly. When somebody says you're speaking too quickly, to make that adjustment. And also, I would personally, my ideal facilitator would be, it doesn't matter what color they are, it doesn't matter what size or shape they are, it doesn't matter how old they are, how young they are, but it's irrelevant. But what I would relate to is somebody who is also disabled, because it's a little bit about kind of, if you're a disabled person and you're in a group where someone else is facilitating the group and they're also disabled, you can relate to them a little bit more, even if they're a man and they're sort of mid-20s, because I'm working class if they're from like an upper class background, but if they have the same disability as you, there's that sort of shared experience. That's my ideal.
Thank you ever so much for sharing that. Let's a little round of applause. We have probably time for one more person in the room to share. Does any group, we've got a hand back up there, does that group want to come up?
Well, it'll be me, but
Come on.
we'll get the shouting from the back, so it'll be fine. So we have this gorgeous piece of art. Actually, let me just. So it's very good, thank you. Yeah, it's the front of the big issue, but we've added extra text. So that makes us artists. So 3 kind of bits of things we've added. The first one is, so we got this going on. It says the Great British Rhino, by which we mean thick skin, but hopefully good eyes. So there's a bit of that for as a facilitator. It's a kind of accept what people are saying, but at the same time, just be kind of watching like a hawk rhino. Anyway, bear with. So the second one was this one here, which it came from a gardening thing, but it says, and I'm sure you can all read it. It says, understanding shade. And I quite like that, because when you get into the detail, it's actually talking about different types of trees. Yeah, well, it would be because it's gardening. But what it's really saying is, I think, understanding shade in the kind of facilitation sense, when you're throwing it, when it's being thrown, when it's there. So I put understanding shade underneath this beautifully drawn reindeer, kind of underneath the reindeer. Anyway, and finally, there's this one here which is talking about moving up the pecking order. And I think, again, it was that idea of understanding. I think it was something that people mentioned here, which is understanding hierarchies and structures and disadvantages and everything else. I'm not sure, as a facilitator, whether you need to move on up the pecking order, but I think you need to understand that there is one, and that you're in it somewhere. So there we go, top 3 things, and a beautiful reindeer.
So I think we shall now, unless anyone is desperate share. Okay, we've got one group, but one last one. Yes, bring it up, come on. Please share your beautiful artwork with us. Oh, glitter.
Yeah, next to sparkling. So we must relearn how to be honest, love, watch, be creative, garden, yes, challenge. We have to feed your inner glamour, sparkle with glitter, glow and layers, and keeping you safe.
That is lovely. So we've also got one on the screen that someone has drawn with a little mouse with some little shoes on, and that is so cute. Obviously, a very good artist. So there is a Padlet if anyone wants to take a photo of what we've created and put it up there if you didn't feel confident with speaking and just want to put it there so that everyone, it becomes memorialised there for everyone to look at. We will put the link up on the screen. That's kind of it for the talking bit. It is now just kind of you time. You can socialise, you can drink, you can have something to eat. I just want to say a fantastic thank you to our wonderful facilitators. Morgan's already have to run off, but if you want to hear more from her, I can highly recommend her podcast, One from the Vaults, and you can also find her on Twitter at Morgan M. Page. Kennedy is amazing, and you can see all of the projects that they are up to on their website, kennedywalker.info. Yeah, I'm getting the nod. And if you want to hear anything more about like what Naya does, Gendered Intelligence, would that be the place to go? So yeah, Gender Intel on Twitter, or www.genderintelligence.org, and that is where you can keep up with that. If you have liked anything you've heard today and think, oh, I might like some facilitation training, hit me up. I'm going to be around all evening. You can go onto the New Economy Organisers website, and you can also find us on Twitter at Neon. So just find a way to contact us and I'll get back in contact with you and you can grab me here later today. Thank you ever so much, especially to Ilona and Sunifa, who have been doing so much making the online version, and to all of my wonderful, beautiful Neon colleagues who have supported this today. Thank you ever so much, everyone.